began my writing career, I'd say back in 2003. At that time, I was a television news reporter for WPRI TV, Channel 12. And I loved my job because I got to get out into the state of Rhode Island every day and interview people. One day I'd be interviewing the governor at the State House, another day I'd be at the Ash Street Jail in Fall River, interviewing a prisoner, or I would be at a murder scene or the scene of a fire. So I really got to get a good feeling about, gain a great understanding of, I think, humanity and what we're all about, and to meet a lot of people throughout Rhode Island. But while I was covering these stories, murders, child abuse, animal abuse, political corruption, even like education or healthcare stories, I would say to myself, I just couldn't help but feel, and John, you may feel this way, like, who are human beings? How did we get to this point? I often would find it very upsetting. Who is mankind? What have we become? And it was around, that point, around 2003, I had this scene sort of come into my mind, and it was the planet Earth. Like, if you were in outer space, just out hanging there in outer space, and you look down at the Earth, sort of like if you believe in God, God's perspective, and you saw what mankind was doing to themselves, to each other, to the planet, to animals, the environment, everything, how would you feel? And I just felt that if there is a creator, he wouldn't be too happy with where we are at, ourselves and how we treat each other or the environment. So it was such a strong feeling, I felt compelled to begin to write the story. I didn't know where the story would go. I really didn't. I just knew I had this scene and that the scene was very important. And I loved writing, and I thought, well, let me just try to write a book. So I wrote that first scene, and then one scene led to another, led to another, led to another, and this book was coming together. And as you mentioned, John, in my bio, I often felt that there was something with me that I can't explain or identify that would help me put my story together. I felt like would guide me to the right research, or just put a word or an idea in my head. And sometimes I would see a scene that was out of place. And if I was toiling away the story and I wrote 6 or 7 chapters, I would then see a scene that really belonged at the end. And I'd say, but I don't know how I'm gonna get from here to the end. I just had to learn to trust my instinct, that it was right, it felt good, it felt right. So I would write it, and eventually it would come together and make sense. I found writing my first novel, 13th Apostle, a very scary experience because I was afraid of what people would think. Would people not like this? Would they be offended by some of the scenes? And the 13th Apostle is the first of a trilogy. So there's the 13th Apostle, Divine Providence, and Thy Kingdom Come. And it fits in the religious thriller genre. So you might think of Da Vinci Code. It's not religious per se, but it's a religious thriller. And my grandmother was alive at the time, and she was in her 90s, and there were some very intense scenes, and I'm like, if my grandmother reads this, she's gonna be so mad. She's not gonna like it. And I love my grandmother. I don't want her to be upset or disappointed. But I had to remain true to these compelling feelings I had to write this story, and I did. And when I gave it to her, Grandma Smith, I was so afraid of what she would say. And then I said, so what do you think? When she was done, she called me, Raina, I read the book, come on over. And I'm like, okay. So I went over there, and she handed the book back to me. It was just computer pages printed out on print paper. It wasn't even a book yet. She says, I can't believe I have a granddaughter that's capable of writing a book like this. She was so impressed. She was one of 20 children that grew up on a farm in Johnston. And they didn't have much money, and no one went to college, and she was so impressed. So she was so happy. And I said, what do you think about that scene, with the priest and the lady? And she's like, she was able to sort of digest everything in the book. Writing for me is my greatest passion. It's what I'm most proud of personally and professionally. We all have to work for a living, and I love my job at Care New England. I truly, truly do. But if I could do anything, my dream life would be staying home every day and just writing novels. So one of the proudest compliments I had with respect to the 13th Apostle. So I wrote the book, I put it out, I launched it on the Rhode show on Channel 12. And someone wrote to me and said, I want to thank you for writing the 13th Apostle, because there's a scene in the book about forgiveness, which sometimes I draw from personal experiences. So many years ago, my boyfriend's father was dying, and his father was much older. He was dying. His father was a very bad person. He didn't want to go see his father. He didn't want to say goodbye. He was such a vile person. So I encouraged him to go. So we went, and he was on one side of his father, I was on the other, and the man was in a coma. And my boyfriend literally, so we got there like 7 o'clock at night, and he told his father everything he thought about him, what a terrible person he was, for about 30 minutes. The next 30 minutes, he forgave him. He said, maybe you did the best you could. And just proceeded to say, and said, I forgive you, my sister forgives you, my brother forgives you, I want you to go in peace. Literally, this really happened. His name was Frank. He opened his eyes, sat up, took in a deep breath, like looked at the wall, and kind of went back down and died within 1 hour. And I was in my 20s. It was so powerful that years later I would tell people about this story because it was real. It really happened. I believe it was because that man was forgiven. And so I would tell people, and I would feel that that wasn't enough, just telling the story. And then when I started writing this book, I was about halfway through, and there was a scene where Father Joseph has a really bad guy for a father. And I gave that scene to Father Joseph, and you'll see that scene in the book, and it's about the power of forgiveness. So this reader said, I want to thank you for writing the 13th Apostle. Because of that chapter, I had a father like that I haven't spoken to for many decades. He's dying, like this guy in the book, that was real. And I went to his hospital, his bedside, in a hospital in Boston. I forgave him, and it released me. And I wouldn't have done it if I hadn't read your book. So even, everyone wants to sell millions and millions of books and make millions and millions of dollars, and that's great. It's also so rewarding to have a reader write to you and say, I was able to forgive my father where I couldn't before I read your book or that chapter. So that was a real highlight for me as a writer. And it was, the 13th Apostle was so well received. It really I didn't know it was going to be a trilogy. The first book, when I wrote the ending, I didn't know this, but I wrote the ending and I was like, there's gonna be another book. I didn't know myself. And it just sort of just rolled into the second book and then into the third book, Thy Kingdom. So I'll show you, this is the second book. Whoops. Divine Providence is the second book, and I draw, first part of the storyline, I draw from my experience working for the Secretary of State's office, Ralph Mollis. So we have a character who's also a director of communications, and she gets into the history of the State House in the state of Rhode Island, which I really, really loved. And that book leads into the final installment of the trilogy, Thy Kingdom Come, which is set in hell. But it's not fire and brimstone, people being tortured. It's nothing like that. It's actually quite beautiful and thrilling to be there. And the character that's in hell knows something. Why would it be so nice like this? But there's a sinister reason why. It's pretty interesting. So I really love this book. I love all of the books, but my last book, The Vampire, is set in Newport. I wrote the vampire, I always imagined Mads Mikkelsen, if you know who that actor is. I don't know if he played Hannibal, an NBC TV show, Hannibal. So he's from Denmark. I imagined him as the vampire, and I sort of wrote that book with him in mind to play that part. Again, set in Newport in a Gilded Age mansion. He's hundreds of years old, and he only kills bad people. So he's a little bit of a vigilante. He reads the newspaper, I think the Warwick Beacon, he orders a subscription, he watches television, and he finds out who the bank robbers are, or the corrupt politicians, or whomever, and he'll track them down. And he has to feed, so he'll kill those people. And I might have drawn from some people I don't like in Rhode Island. Did you see, did you see them get offed in the book? I don't name anyone, but so that's a little bit about the books, a little bit about my creative writing process. Does anyone have any questions?